I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Basnayake.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm stepping in for Mr. Kasum Ponamperuma, who was unable to come to Switzerland due to visa problems. That is also something that we have to face with regard to coming to the UN, people from Sri Lanka. There's something unjust about it as well. As I said, I'm just stepping in, so I haven't had much time to prepare myself. But I'm trying to, I will try to address the topic that he had chosen, that is Resolution 30 stroke 1 and 40 stroke 1 as an obstacle to the true reconciliation process in Sri Lanka. Let me start by going back a little bit to the history. The United Nations Human Rights Council, in its benign wisdom, passed Resolution 31 on 1st October 2015 and subsequently on 21st March 2019, the Resolution 40 stroke 1 to promote reconciliation, accountability and human rights in Sri Lanka. Now, little did they understand at the time, and seemingly even less now, the inescapable truth that reconciliation cannot be forced upon Sri Lankans of any or all persuasions. It's true for the Sinhalese, as also for the Tamils, I believe, and certainly also not for the Muslims. Especially not by ostensibly well-meaning outsiders, some of whom had previously subjugated the island to colonial servitude for over 400 years. We are a bit sensitive about this issue still, for all these years. The United Nations organization follows, as it always does, a beaten track that often fails to reach the planned goal. Sri Lanka is following one of those beaten tracks without much hope of reaching the target in the near future, just like Mr. Paliwadena also mentioned. In its generally benign wisdom, the UNHRC has failed to recognize that its model of conflict resolution practiced in Sri Lanka and in some other countries around the globe is, by design or through accident, perpetuating the conflict and the permanent state of crisis in the country. The fault is in the model itself, which no doubt had functioned reasonably well in its country of origin. However, some the experts and practitioners in the field believe and dispute that success of the South African model of truth and reconciliation that chose to utilize restorative justice instead of retributive justice as the first step towards genuine and lasting reconciliation. And it is certainly not the model that suits Sri Lanka. In South Africa, critics claim that the main perpetrators of violence and human rights abuses, the apartheid regime, a tiny minority that ruled over a large population of African people, clearly got away from having to pay for their horrendous crimes. However, the biggest flaw in trying to adopt the South African model is not appreciating the dissimilarities between the two conflicts and the very different social realities existing in the two countries. South Africa did not have a vicious terrorist organization masquerading as a National Liberation Front. The ANC, by in a large part actually, literally, was a non-violent organization. They did practice a little bit of violence, but not against any civilians or any soldiers, in fact. That was at the very beginning. In Sri Lanka, South Africa did not have this. Sri Lanka had the most innovatively malicious terror organization in the world that invented the most savage form of terrorism, suicide bombing. Let's not forget that fact, that suicide bombers still operate all over the world in the most horrendous fashion. It has even gone down to New Zealand, a nation that we thought was extremely peaceful, away from all the terrors. But not only natural catastrophes have touched them, but also human terrorism that has really totally shaken them. And this is an invention of the LTTE. Let's not ever forget that. In South Africa, the white minority community practiced apartheid to keep the indigenous people in perpetual subjugation and humiliation. In Sri Lanka, the majority ethnic group, the Sinhalese, discriminated against a minority in what was perhaps a misguided belief that they were righting all wrongs committed by the previous colonial rulers, the British, who did indeed discriminate against the Sri Lankan, the Sinhalese, amongst the Sri Lankans. A section of the Tamils took to armed struggle to carve out a separate state. And let's not forget that before that, ultra-left-wing Sinhalese group called the Janata Vimukti Perumana, the JVP, staged the first insurrection ever in the history of Sri Lanka in 1971. Till then, Sri Lanka had never known anything about guerrilla warfare or any kinds of terror acts. This was the beginning of the first terror acts, and the LTTE was a kind of off-breed of this terrorism that the JVP started, and unfortunately, it went out of proportion. In fact, the largest rebel group, which is the LTTE, turned into a brutal fighting machine that used every conceivable means to terrorize the civilian populations, Tamil, Muslim, excuse me, and the Sinhalese, as well as to fight the police and armed forces of the state of Sri Lanka. However, the model of reconciliations is not the only issue that critics of the UNHRC resolutions have in mind. The strongest of objections are leveled at the conditions and strictures that the UNHRC has imposed on Sri Lanka to deliver on its commitments to accountability and protection of human rights. Having foreign judges judging on the Sri Lankan so-called alleged perpetrators of human rights, which is mainly the army and the politicians. That's one of the key conditions that the Sri Lankans are totally mad about, angry, in other words. In fact, the UNHRC has consistently ignored the fact that Sri Lanka is a sovereign nation that had emerged from centuries of foreign subjugation only after the Second World War. The UNHRC is acting in the place of the British rulers of yesteryear, demanding the unequivocal right of him to interfere and dictate in the internal affairs of independent Sri Lanka. There was not even a shadow of impartiality in its determination to bend the Sri Lankan authorities to the will of the UN and the Western coterie at its helm. Indeed, the very first United Nations Special Rapporteur to Sri Lanka, Ms. Navi Pillai, was a South African of Tamil origin, chosen perhaps to rub the noses of the Sinhalese government, the Sri Lankan government, and the people of Sri Lanka. Many Sri Lankans questioned the impartiality of Ms. Pillai simply because they viewed the appointment as a clear provocation towards the sensitivity of the majority Sri Lankans. Sri Lanka does not require the experts and judges and the like to promote accountability and dispense justice to its citizens. Sri Lanka does require help in some vital areas. However, it is for the UN and other bodies or nations for the support. It's, however, for Sri Lanka to ask UN and other bodies or nations for that support. It is not for the UN or any other organization or nations to dictate what help Sri Lanka should ask for or should require for her to govern the country justly and equitably. Sri Lankan experts on human rights and past conflict feel justified in questioning the true resolution's effectiveness in diverting lasting reconciliation between the Tamil, Sinhalese and Muslim communities in Sri Lanka, on other grounds as well. Fundamentally, most critics view the framework of the reconciliation and accountability process as deeply flawed, leading to the perpetuation of the conflict and disharmony. The almost 5 years since the adoption of the first resolution has brought little rapprochement between the two communities, and divisions continue as the Tamil community shows considerable intransigence in its demands and aspirations. The UNHRC sessions in Geneva, Switzerland, is in itself a focal point for detractors of genuine reconciliation, as they mount relentless campaigns to sow half-truths and blatant misinformation. You see that every day, I suppose, when you come to the UN during the sessions. Yeah. The elephant in the room is, of course, the vociferous, financially heavily endowed Tamil diaspora, spread across Europe, North America, and Australia. It is an incorrigible group that has no will or the desire for reconciliation, but only the unconcealed hankering after Elam. It's a group that wields considerable influence in centers of power in many Western nations, and it's a group that many Sri Lankan experts believe the Western countries reciprocally utilizes to keep Sri Lanka in check. In other words, the Tamil diaspora is forced to undermine Sri Lanka and perforce destabilize the nation whenever the need arises. In the absence of a universally acceptable approach to facilitate reconciliation and accommodation of the just aspirations of the Tamil people, the UNHRC should, in its infinite wisdom, cooperate with the government of Sri Lanka to build a framework uniquely applicable to Sri Lanka, which will deliver in the shortest possible time all the objectives, including lasting peace and harmony. It is the only way that the stakeholders will view Sri Lanka as a sovereign state and not a vassal of the Western coterie. It is the only way that the Tamil diaspora will realize that the pursuit of the Tamil Elam project is inimical to the independence and social, economic stability of the island and genuine and lasting peace in Sri Lanka. The UN should persuade the Tamil diaspora to support and cooperate with the government of Sri Lanka to build a framework for reconciliation and the search for a lasting peace that satisfies the just aspirations of all communities and sections of society in Sri Lanka. Instead of pursuing a destructive goal, the Tamil diaspora should work for a productive dialogue with the government of Sri Lanka and the various communities in the country, seeking out the best means to promote reconciliation and strengthen the fundamental rights of all citizens. For its part, the government of Sri Lanka has a duty by all its citizens to guarantee their well-being and their fundamental rights. It also has a sacred responsibility to protect its vulnerable citizens, including the minorities of every shade and persuasion. Sri Lanka, in turn, has to double its efforts and show its determination to uphold the fundamental rights of all its citizens, particularly the minorities and the most vulnerable members of society. Indeed, it should increase its efforts to search for a lasting solution to the communal problems that have beset the island nation for generations. The government of Sri Lanka owes it to all the fallen soldiers and civilians alike. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for